Historians will sometimes call the Salem Witch Trials like a powder keg ready to explode, the perfect storm. A lot of things went wrong in exactly the right way to let a panic completely consume a community, to allow the careful rules and procedures that had dictated witch trials in the past to be kind of completely pushed to the side, and to allow 19 innocent people to be hanged, some of whom were very clearly innocent.
Welcome to Real Women's Work.
I'm a production designer and set decorator for feature film and television shows.
News stories.
I am an advocate for crime victims.
From real women.
I founded a website called Family Travel Magazine.
About how they work.
My work is as an oral facial myologist.
Every week.
I am a professional circus artist and entertainer.
Subscribe now.
I work for my county jail and I am a nurse there.
Subscribe to the Real Women's Work podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Rachel Christ-Doane is the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum. And for those who have never been to the Salem Witch Museum, it is a place that allows us to really understand the humans that were involved in the Salem Witch Trials. Not just the accused and the murdered, but also the accusers and those that were involved in the climate prior to it reaching the result of the Salem Witch Trials. Rachel is so knowledgeable. She's so insightful, and she presents everything in a way that makes the information accessible, and personally allowed me to feel totally fine with how much I misunderstood the Salem Witch Trials. So listen in. You will learn a lot about not only that point in history, but also you might be able to relate it to some situations you face in your own life today. So listen in with Rachel Christ-Doane, Director of Education for the Salem Witch Museum. One of the things, I turned 50 this past October, and one of the things I have found so exciting about this age is being able to be very open about all the stuff I don't know. And my son is 17 and a huge history lover, and I've gotten to learn so much about history through him. But I don't know a lot about history, and that's the truth. And only in my older adulthood, or this middle-age adulthood, am I really finding the excitement and connection and joy in learning about history. And a lot of stuff that I learned about in school, or I was supposed to learn about in school, was very compartmentalized, and there was no context and nothing connected, and I didn't understand it was real people, and I didn't know how this went with this. And one of the things, I've been to the Salem Witch Museum many times, most recently yesterday in preparation for today. And one of the things that has hit me before, but really hit me yesterday, was that when we look at the Salem Witch Trials, we can learn so much about so many parts of history and why they're relevant now, and what really, we can get a picture into what might have happened then. And I just want to start by really admitting to everybody that all the learning that I've done about the witch trials, I'm from New England, so it's a thing that we talk about. My mindset has always been, how could these people have been so stupid? How could they have thought this was actually happening? And I'll tell you, it wasn't until yesterday, watching the presentation and then going through the exhibit after with the guided tour, that it really hit me that we're still doing it today. I'm still one of those stupid people.
Well, you got the point, so you get the gold star for the visit.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's really, I don't know, having the presentation connect us to the people, connect us to the realities of Rebecca Nurse, of John Proctor, of all of these people, and then walking through to see it connected to McCarthyism and the AIDS epidemic and all of these things in my own rememberings, it really hit hard. So I guess I would love to ask you, maybe to start, why do you do the work that you do, Rachel?
So I gotta say, I love that we're starting the conversation with this is what I don't know, right? Because I find that anybody who claims to know the history of the Salem Witch Trials, to know everything about it, is not a reliable source, because we're all still learning about it constantly and our understanding of it is changing. What we knew 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago changes. And that's one of the kind of interesting things about history, is that it's kind of always shifting, and we're learning more and we're learning different ways to kind of unpack it. Especially history that's this distant. It's very interesting. And one of the things that historian Marilyn Roach, who is the author of the Salem Witch Trials Day by Day Chronicle, which is essentially an encyclopedia of the Salem Witch Trials. It is literally a day by day account of the Salem Witch Trials. Truly, it's basically a dictionary. She is the first one to always say, I don't know, I'll have to look it up. And that's something that's really stuck with me throughout my career. Um, it's always a mark of someone who's ready to learn, or who is, wise, you could say, who will be the first to admit what they don't know. So getting into the story of the Salem Witch Trials it's kind of endlessly fascinating, because there's so much to unpack around this event. There were so many people pulled into the Salem Witch Trials. It's such a complicated event with so many moving pieces. So to kind of answer, the long way around answering your question is, the reason why I first became interested in the Salem Witch Trials was I was an undergraduate student fresh out of college. I was really interested in, actually, I was still in college at the time. Was really interested in women's history, and I wasn't quite sure, what to do with that, how I would feed myself, professionally getting into that kind of subsect of history. And I kind of stumbled upon the Salem Witch Museum by accident. I was like 20 years old, and just wanted a job in a museum, and worked here for a summer and never left, because the story is just, it's a very emotional story. It's a story that is very relevant to women's history and women's experiences. There's a lot of elements of the story that resonate to today, the way that women who are kind of unusual, outspoken, mouthy, the way that we talk about them now actually in many ways parallels the way they were talked about in the 17th century. Um, and then the deeper you go, the more you realize we have a lot in common with the people of 1692, the tendency to scapegoat being the most important similarity, in my opinion, to find a person or a group to blame when we feel threatened or we feel powerless or scared. That is a very human compulsion. And once you start thinking about it in those terms, the events of 1692 sound a lot like events that have happened in more recent history, 20th century history, 21st century history. It's the same narrative again and again, tweak the details a little bit, but we're still having this same conversation. So it really holds me in that here we're telling this important story, but we're also really touching on a topic that's incredibly important for modern society. So that's really rewarding. It's really fun to be able to talk to people through that lens of making history relatable and making it completely relevant to the modern day.
Yesterday, I noticed, maybe for the first time as I was watching the presentation, or understood for the first time, the setting of the stage that maybe was the beginnings of what allowed this all to happen, but also for the young girls that started all of this. Will you speak just a little bit about their day to day, why this was a kind of a great opportunity for them to have something going on, is how I understood it?
Yeah, it's interesting because the roles of the accusers is again one of those, just it's very complicated. It's fascinating to really dive into it. So if we're just speaking about the first two girls who become afflicted, so to say that they believed they were being hurt by witchcraft, their names are Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Betty is 9, Abigail is 11. They in particular are living in a very difficult household. Their guardian, Samuel Parris, is the minister of Salem Village in 1692. He is actually the fourth minister to take over this post. in quite a short period of time. They had been granted the right to have a church in the 1670s, which was kind of Salem Village's first step towards becoming their own independent community. They are at that time kind of a rural section of Salem town, which is what is the modern city of Salem. So all of this actually begins in what is today Danvers. So they do eventually succeed in separating. In 1692, though, it's all one big community. So they have their new church, they have their minister, but basically this factional divide has split the community. One half likes the minister, one half doesn't. A candidate will come in, they fight and they fight and they fight until they drive him out. A new minister comes in, and we're on to our fourth minister in 1692. And Reverend Paris is the first to be ordained, which theoretically meant he was supposed to be there to stay. But half the village still dislikes him, and the way that you show your displeasure with a minister at this point is you withhold your share of his salary. So in the winter of 1691, Reverend Paris is getting more and more frustrated. He's angry that he's not getting his salary. And at this time, a salary is partially, monetary, but it's also partially firewood, that life-saving fuel source that you desperately need in a cold, brutal New England winter. So the family's running out of firewood. Samuel Parris feels very disrespected by the community. He's preaching more and more intense sermons about the dangers of the devil and the invisible world. His daughter and his niece are living in this household along with other children. There's a son and another daughter in the house as well. And they have to be quite frightened, alarmed by their father. And children don't have a lot of power in colonial New England, particularly females, young girls. You're following the orders of your parents, particularly your father. Your life is really circulating around doing your chores, contributing to the household, learning to read the Bible, because that was essential for everyone at this time. Even girls were taught to read so they might learn the Bible. So it's really, it's a rigid life, not quite as rigid as we always imagine, but girls don't have a lot of opportunities to express themselves or have really autonomy over their lives. And this takes us into January of 1692. So Betty and Abigail start experiencing this strange illness that is soon diagnosed as the effects of witchcraft. And of course, the rest is history, as they say.
It's so interesting to me. This lasted a relatively short period of time, right? I mean,
Yes.
how many months?
Yeah, so from the time that the affliction starts, we would call it January of 1692, and the last person is getting out of jail by the spring, essentially, early summer of 1693. So all in all, it's quite a short period of time. The witch trials themselves, though, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, that's 4 months. It starts in June, it ends in September. So while there's pre-trial examinations. There's a secondary court created the next year that's a more reasonable court. So the whole thing, you could say, is about a year and a half, but what we think of as the trials, the deadly trials, are just a span of 4 months.
Rachel, why is it that something that was so short-lived relative to, thinking of other wars and horrible atrocities that have happened throughout our history, something that was so short-lived, and I know how this sounds, I just don't have other verbiage to speak it, but involved a relatively small number of people, became such a widely talked about thing. And I'll just add for those listening, I didn't realize until I started learning about the Salem Witch Trials specifically that we were just this tiny bit of a much larger thing happening throughout Europe. I did not know that. So, and I think still when we in the US talk about the witch trials, we're talking about the Salem Witch Trials, right? So can you speak to all of that a little bit?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, as you say, the Salem witch trials are actually a relatively short, relatively non-violent witch trial. Truly, the trials that happened during the early modern period in Europe were much larger, much deadlier. You have cases where hundreds of people are executed during one series of trials, whereas in Salem, 19 people are hanged, one man is tortured to death. Approximately 5 people, or we could say 5 people, are known to have died in jail. Some speculate there may be others who die as well, but the ones we can certainly connect to the Salem Witch Trials are 5. So, I mean, when you compare that with Europe, that's quite a small witch panic. But the thing about Salem is it's very, very unusual for the English colonies. So nothing like this had ever happened here in New England, in colonial North America before this. Witch panics were actually quite tame here, all things considered. New England courts really demanded a strict standard of evidence. You had to really be able to prove someone was a witch. More often than not, even though there were certainly many suspicions, accusations of witchcraft, someone might be tried, but usually they were acquitted. In fact, several people involved in the Salem witch trials had been accused of witchcraft before and gone to trial and been acquitted or had their cases dropped. So it was much more common for witchcraft panics to be subdued here, because they really had a strong kind of grip on not letting things get out of control, especially in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had quite a good track record, if to put it that way. In the 30 years leading up to the Salem witch trials, there are many suspicions of witchcraft. There is one fatal witch trial in 30 years. One person had been executed, and it was in 1688, so relatively recently. Um, so the Salem witch trials are this moment of kind of insanity, let's say. And even to add to kind of the strange circumstances, the Salem witch trials happened very late in the witch trials period. England decriminalizes witchcraft in, I believe it's 1730, thereabouts. It's not long after the Salem witch trials. You can no longer convict someone of witchcraft in England. So this is kind of adding to the unusual nature of the panic. Basically, historians will sometimes call the Salem witch trials like a powder keg ready to explode, the perfect storm. A lot of things went wrong in exactly the right way to let a panic completely consume a community, to allow the careful rules and procedures that had dictated witch trials in the past to be kind of completely pushed to the side, and to allow 19 innocent people to be hanged, some of whom were very clearly innocent. While some, again, had those suspicions from the past, maybe seemed like clearer cases, there are quite a few people who were executed in 1692 that outraged others. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs. George Burroughs was one of the former ministers of Salem Village. So these accusations in particular, these convictions, it was clear to people while the Salem witch trials were going on that something was wrong, that a miscarriage of justice was happening. If not that innocent people were being executed, that innocent people were being arrested. And when all was said and done, approximately 150, 170, the estimates kind of vary, but nearly 200 people are arrested as a result of the Salem witch trials. 20 people are murdered, 5 people die in jail. Those are numbers unlike anything that had been seen here before. And again, the outrage about it is happening while the trials are taking place and in the immediate aftermath. So as early as 1720, you see the Salem witch trials being used as a critical metaphor to say you're behaving unfairly, fanatically, irrationally. And that's, of course, a critical metaphor we continue to use today to say witch hunt, or you're behaving like they did in Salem, the Salem witch trials. That is understood as a critical metaphor. Whether it's being used correctly or not is a whole other ballgame. But, we understand that and continue to invoke that as a metaphor to this day. So to answer, it's a long story short. The Salem witch trials were so large, so deadly, so unusual, and they happened so late that it's very clear to people that this was not a necessary protective measure, and that enters American discourse immediately as that kind of critical metaphor, and it's stayed with us very much to this day.
Rebecca Nurse is one of the feels, I don't know, the most emotional. They all feel so emotional, but maybe will you tell us about Rebecca Nurse for those who don't know who she is?
Yeah, Rebecca Nurse is, she's a very famous story from the Salem witch trials because, again, even at the time, it was shocking that she had been arrested, let alone convicted. So she is about 71 years old in 1692. She is a grandmother, so she has grown kids and grandkids. She is a member of the Salem Village Church, which is quite an important status at this time. Not everybody got to be a member of the church. Everyone was required to attend, but membership holds this other kind of spiritual significance for the Puritans. So she's a fully communing member, and she's very much respected by her community on the whole. You know, her neighbors come forward, many of her neighbors come forward when she's arrested and sign petitions on her behalf saying, um, she's a good, godly woman. You know, I know she's a hard worker. I know she's a mother and a wife. And, you know, by all accounts, this kind of model Puritan woman. So the fact that she is arrested, she's put through a trial. She's actually initially found not guilty during the trial. And then the witnesses who are present react so violently to that pronouncement that they retry her using that as new evidence, this kind of violent affliction in the courtroom, and ultimately find her guilty. And her family really tries to get that conviction dropped to buy her more time. You know, they petition the governor himself, and it's all to no avail. And she is hanged on July 19th.
And it's suspected that her deafness was part of what led to her conviction. Is that right?
Yeah, it seems like her hearing is not what it once was, right? So during her examination, her trial, they bring in another person who is also a prisoner, has been accused of witchcraft, but is now giving information about other people. And this happened throughout the trials. People who were accused flipped and also became accusers, probably in an attempt to save themselves or buy themselves more time. So a prisoner is brought in to give evidence against her. And Rebecca makes this comment, but she is one of us. And so when they're retrying her, they say, and what about that comment? What did you mean? And she doesn't hear them. And she's been tried, you know, she's been going through a trial all day at this point. The way that this is usually described is she's old, she's exhausted, she has some hearing difficulty, and she just stands there and doesn't respond. And she's later asked by her family, why didn't you respond to this? And she says, I didn't hear the question. And so that's one of the things that they bring when they petition the governor, and it doesn't make any difference. They still execute her.
How do we know all of this?
So, primary source documents is kind of our first touchstone into the history. So, when we say primary sources, we mean documents created by eyewitness observers. So, many of them are court records. So, the examination notes before the trials are very helpful. People had these pre-trial examinations where they're really kind of grilled by magistrates, and that reveals a lot of really important information. Interestingly, actually, the record book from the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is the court that sits between June and September, has been lost. Its whereabouts are unknown. It's possible it was destroyed. Some have said, you know, people were ashamed of the Salem Witch Trials. It's possible it was just intentionally destroyed. It's also entirely possible that record book has just been misfiled somewhere and will turn up someday, in an attic, in somebody's basement. Things like this actually do happen, you know, not necessarily with the same significance of finding the court record book from the Salem Witch Trials, but stranger things have been known to happen in the archives. So that is still possible. But we have the depositions that were submitted to the court. Um, and then we also have certain eyewitness accounts, letters written by people, petitions written by the accused. So that's kind of our first entry. We also have a couple of books that are produced by participants. So Cotton Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World, which is kind of considered to be the government sanctioned version of the trials. So he is writing from the perspective of the witch trials were not a giant mistake, and there were really witches here, and this was important, and we didn't mess up, you know, kind of. So it's called, Emerson Baker calls it the first government cover up in our country's history, which you could argue it is. But then we have other books written by skeptics who were also present. Robert Califf writes a book in 1700 where he just completely tears down Cotton Mather's account. there's a lot of personal issues between the two of them. So if you like melodrama reading, Caleb's book is actually quite interesting because he really personally goes after Cotton Mather as well. But he reveals a lot of really important details that help us understand the trials, details that wouldn't be available to us otherwise. And then there's another book that's kind of the middle ground, written by John Hale, who's a minister who also witnessed many of the events, where he kind of says, this was the perspective of us at the beginning when we did think we were in a state of emergency and there was this real threat. And as time goes on, we figured it out. By the time we figured it out, innocent people had been hurt. And he really methodically kind of goes through the mistakes that were made. So that's essentially our where we get the bulk of our information. As the years go on, you also have what we would call secondary sources. So historians' interpretations of these events. So, for example, the last royal governor of Massachusetts writes this big, bulky history of Massachusetts, and he includes his version of the Salem Witch Trials in that account. And because he's living much closer to the trials, he has information that has since been lost. He actually had documents in his house he was looking at that were destroyed in the Stamp Act riots. So you talk about your cross events in American history. So those are kind of the main ways that we learn about the Salem Witch Trials. And you would think that with kind of such a finite amount of resources, we would have figured out everything there is to know by now. But every day, it seems, or every passing year, new information is still kind of coming to light that helps us understand more about the events of the Salem Witch Trials.
It's one of the things that I have been so awed by in my little tiny, trying to learn. There's just the smallest amount about all of this is the layers and the depth and the complexity. And I got that sense. I certainly couldn't articulate it, but hearing you say every day it changes, that makes sense to me. Even just because even as I've been trying to read a few things and watch a few things and attend a few things, I think I could spend the rest of my life, trying to learn about this.
And people do. Yep, that's true.
At least this is, I'll say this for me, but I suspect it's true for a lot of people. There is I don't want to say a casualness when we talk about the Salem Witch Trials, but there's an almost entertainment value folklore.
Yes.
To the Salem Witch Trials. And I don't know if that's true throughout the country or because of where I grew up, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But the deeper I get into learning this, obviously that goes away. It doesn't, it's still exciting and interesting because seeing how it all connects. And I don't know, Rachel, I don't really know what I'm asking you, except would you maybe speak to that? Before I knew about it, it felt like entertainment folklore, for lack of a better verbiage. And now it doesn't. It feels profound and important. And I understand these were real people. These were real women. And then when I start to look at the witch panic throughout Europe, that feels really important and profound. So anything you can speak to in that regard?
Yeah, so I would say you're certainly not alone in that respect. Most people, I would argue, feel that way, or that's their first entry into the topic. And it's kind of tempting for us working in Salem, living in Salem, being so enwrapped in this history to kind of shame people for that, and every day we have people come through the museum. The amount of, I don't want to, point fingers, but oftentimes it's dads, men traveling with women who come to the admissions date and say, "Oh, I'm here with all my witches," or, make some sort of joke like that. And our staff kind of roll their eyes, it's every day. It's constant here in Salem. And it is kind of jarring being so in touch with the history. But I always say that you do need to take a step back from it and think of in terms of witchcraft is quite a unique subject because it does have this very violent, very dark origin. Witchcraft begins as a serious criminal offense that is innocent people are charged with, right? Until we have this scientific breakthrough that tells us people can, in fact, hurt their neighbor's cattle with a glance of their eye or, cast evil spells or so forth. we can safely assume all of the individuals, the thousands of people who were accused of witchcraft during the early modern period, are innocent people who were scapegoated, right? That is the basis of witchcraft. But it's had a long evolution since then, and that's something that we touch on in our museum. Witchcraft doesn't stay confined to the early modern period the way that other heretical offenses do. Witchcraft continues to move on in popular memory, and it starts to evolve. And the farther away we get from the serious reality of a person in my community might be trying to kill me or my children or my family with witchcraft, you start to move into the time of the Brothers Grimm and the Andersen fairy tales. And witches are the scary women living in the forest. Much of that stereotype is drawn from the real history. You know, pieces of that are taken from real stories that circulated in the early modern period. But it keeps going from there. Once we've kind of have this mythic figure established in pop culture, you start to see it transforming and being played with generation to generation. L. Frank Baum gives us our first good witches in The Wizard of Oz. We have Glinda and the Good Witch of the North. We start to see beautiful witches appearing in popular culture, in Halloween postcards and advertisements at the turn of the 20th century. And then you start to see it appearing in films. Samantha Stevens, right? Bewitched, the girl next door, who's also a witch, which kind of gives rise to this huge other genre that explodes in the 90s. So you see a lot of kids coming of age with Hermione Granger or Wicked or Charmed or Sabrina the Teenage Witch as these role models, and becoming a witch is like a coming of age thing, and it's about women's power and women's autonomy and women being superheroes almost. And it becomes this whole other cultural sensation. And that's not even to mention people religiously identifying with the figure, which also becomes huge in the 20th century and, you know, beyond. So all that to say, witchcraft exists on this huge continuum. The word witch really means something different to every person today. So while it's kind of jarring to see people come into Salem today and want to wear pointed hats and take pictures and see the Hocus Pocus house, you know, the place where the movie was filmed and all that, I always say that there is nothing inherently wrong with that. That is what the witch has become in popular culture. What is a problem is when people come here and intentionally are act disrespectfully. You know, they're behaving inappropriately in graveyards. They are, you know, intentionally making up ghost stories that disparage real people connected with the Salem Witch Trials. You know, that's where things cross a line and it becomes disrespectful. But people being drawn to Salem because of all that the witch represents is just, it's just what it is. It's part of that spectrum. And I suspect the witch will continue to evolve going forward. And we are kind of gifted with this wonderful opportunity to take all these people who come here who are drawn because they loved Harry Potter or they loved Bewitched or The Wizard of Oz or Hocus Pocus or whatever. They come here and then they're introduced to this incredibly important event in American history. Because let's be honest, most people are not spending their leisure time studying colonial history. Some people are, but the average family, not so much. Teenagers, not so much, especially Puritan history. It's dark, it's drab, it's a little bit boring for us often, you know. So we are kind of given this opportunity to bring people into this incredibly important event, and they walk out of here with a deeper understanding of scapegoating and American history and kind of big, broad trends. And then they go back out and they continue to take pictures in front of Hocus Pocus, and that's okay too. You know, it can all exist together, in my opinion.
And maybe there's a little something that's interpreted a little bit differently.
Yes. Maybe the
After the visit.
tasteless jokes will be thought about twice, right? So I won't name names, but there are some places in Salem that do make incredibly tasteless jokes about the Salem Witch Trials and sell them on t-shirts and things like that. That is a huge problem. And those are people who are willfully ignoring the tragedy behind the history and not allowing the kind of continuum to exist, you know, and that's where it becomes a problem, you know, and that will also probably never go away. Salem is not unique in that regard. Other places of dark history have the same kind of tense, you know, tasteless, um, you know, kitschy things associated with it. We're not alone, certainly. That I think is just unfortunately part of human behavior sometimes, especially with something that's dark or sad or tragic. Maybe because it makes us uncomfortable, people make jokes, and that's if you study dark tourism, which is places that have become tourist sites that are based in dark, tragic history, this is something that's experienced to varying degrees, but it's not something that's unusual to say, exclusive to Salem.
How long has the Salem Witch Museum been sharing this presentation?
So the Salem Witch Museum opens its doors in 1972, which makes us just over 50 years old. We started with the main theater presentation, which, considering the fact it's 50 years old, has really withheld the test of time in many ways. We are actually in the process of updating that presentation to bring it in line with some of the newer discoveries. Certain things like the role of Tituba, even where the hangings took place, Proctor's Ledge versus Gallows Hill. These are things that have been um, kind of updated in scholarship as over the past 50 years. So we're finally, making that those necessary updates. But the format and the general, procedure of coming in, sitting in the dark room, seeing the illuminated tableaus, that will all remain the same because it really has remained an effective education style this whole time. It's quite amazing that they made that in the 50s or the 70s.
This is why I asked you that, because long before, not long, but prior to me, even years ago, before me, I thought about making this particular series. We had just moved back to to New England from Denver, and I brought my kids to the Salem Witch Museum, and I was so struck by and wondered aloud with the people I was with, is this the same narration? Is it the same
Yeah.
figures? Is it because it is so effective?
Yeah, it's actually
Still.
they really knocked it out of the park in terms of other museums are starting to do these more immersive theater experiences, and that wasn't a common, or really, I think any place was doing that kind of educational format in the 70s. And it was a choice that was actually made out of necessity because there are so few artifacts connected to the Salem Witch Trials, so few documents, hardly any objects relate connected to the people involved. They couldn't make a traditional artifact centered gallery museum. So they made this other kind of immersive storytelling experience, and they really knocked it out of the park. And they did add the second exhibit in 1999, so that came a little bit later. And that was a decision that was made because Salem was starting to expand and Haunted Happenings was getting popular here. So October was becoming more popular. People were coming and wanting to celebrate Halloween. And as we talked about, fictional witches were getting more popular in the 90s. So people were coming here and asking about, why do witches fly on broomsticks and have pointed hats and green skin and so forth? So we made that second exhibit in an effort to kind of meet people where they were when they came in. This is the backstory of Salem. This is how we follow that spectrum and get to witches in the modern day. And why are these lessons still so important? And that space has really just continued to change and evolve. We actually did a major interpretive update in there in 2020. We squeaked it in just before the pandemic, literally 2 days before the pandemic shut down the country. We finished that installation. I actually got COVID during that installation.
Oh,
but,
no!
Obviously,
Oh,
I'm fine. But
yes. Okay,
the
good.
things we do for our jobs. But that has become a place where we have started to build a small kind of growing artifact collection that we're now adding to year after year. And that's become a place to display early modern books connected to the witch trials, some objects connected to Salem, though again, there's still few. And then some interesting objects connected to the evolving image of the witch, because that's a topic that you can endlessly collect around. And there's some really neat things that we can put on display and will continue to rotate in and out of that space over the years.
A couple more things I'd really love to talk about. This is amazing. This is so great, Rachel. The Octobers in Salem are a thing. I mean, a thing that's I mean, they're, for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, I think everybody, even, from the West Coast must know October in Salem. You are just inundated is an understatement with visitors for all kinds of reasons. And I'm really glad you shared your perspective about existing in historical education around a dark tragedy in a place that is also very festive and entertainment based and celebratory and fun. A lot of fun around that. Like there's a lot of fun around that. So I'm really glad you shared your perspective about that and the idea that you view that as an opportunity to educate those who are willing to be that's not the right way to say it, but as an opportunity to educate. I think that's a really interesting perspective because I've wondered that myself.
Yeah, I always say that my favorite part of October, because October is getting out of hand. It's become incredibly popular, and Salem has kind of become this hub for celebrating Halloween, which is wonderful and it is a ton of fun. But Salem is still a pretty small city, so we are starting to face logistical challenges of too many people are coming and the city's infrastructure can't handle it, which in a way it's wonderful because we have this surge to our economy where many of the small businesses, our museum included, can stay afloat because of October, because we get that spike in visitation. But at the same time, you also have all these logistical challenges of a couple of years ago, for example, the city's plumbing started to break down because the plumbing literally could not handle the amount of people coming to Salem. And at this time, I actually lived in downtown Salem, and our plumbing in our house was being impacted by the spillover from downtown. It was kind of bananas.
Oh, that is
So those
bananas.
are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. But with that being said, you meet a lot of people in October who are not traditional museum goers. You know, they are not necessarily in their leisure time going to seek out going to a history museum. Certainly not a colonial history museum, right? So that's really wonderful. And we often hear people coming in October who don't even know what our museum is. They think it's a haunted house. They have done literally no research. They just grabbed whatever tickets they could and are coming through. And again, that's not necessarily a problem. You know, it's wonderful that you're going to now experience this immersive history lesson. And I always say my favorite part about October is at the very end, we show this formula for a witch hunt, which we say is fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. And then we talk about that in the context of the Salem Witch Trials, but also 3 events from 20th century American history. And my favorite part is when someone's walking out of the second exhibit. Maybe it's like a family all dressed like skeletons. Maybe it's a group of girls dressed like pirates, whatever. People head to toe in full Halloween costume having a really serious conversation about scapegoating. You don't see anything like that's a very unusual experience, but it's awesome. A couple of years ago, I saw a family walking out and they were, 10-year-old, 11-year-old kids having a really engaged conversation with their mom about what a scapegoat is and how that applies to our modern day. And they continued that walking through the museum store. And those are the moments where you're like, yes, this is the benefit of October is you get to and they're going to go back out and continue their Halloween fun in the city. But maybe they'll go home and keep thinking about that. And that's if that's the case, then we've done our job well.
And no matter what reason people come in to your museum, their needs are met. Their hope is met. What they were looking for is met, which is remarkable. Two more questions. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yes, no problem. Yeah.
The first one I think is quick. The second one would take us forever, but I'm going to ask it just to get some thoughts anyway. Prior to Salem becoming such a big October place of tourism, have the Salem Witch Trials always been such a widely known about event?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes and no. So, as widely known as they are today, no. But with that being said, as we talked about earlier, this critical metaphor is something that you do see entering popular culture very early and remaining. And it's very interesting. If you start really delving into American history, the Salem witch trials pop up all the time. So, for example, during the Civil War, as politicians from the North and South are having these fights and, heated political discourse and pamphlet wars in the build up to the Civil War, people reference the Salem witch trials. Southern politicians often counter arguments that slaveholders are, barbaric and, treating people unjustly. And they say, well, you burned people at the stake during the Salem witch trials, you Northerners. So what high horse do you have to stand on? And that is actually a fun fact where we get the misconception about being burned at the stake in Salem. People are burned at the stake as a punishment for witchcraft in Europe. It did not happen here in Salem. They were hanged, which was the typical punishment for a felony offense in English law. It's that discourse during the Civil War where they start saying, well, you were burning Quakers and witches by the cords, so don't preach to us about morals. That enters popular culture and really sticks in. And now, of course, popular culture often depicts the Salem witch trials as people being burned at the stake. So it's a known reference. And there's a woman whose name is Gretchen Adams, a historian, who wrote a book called The Spectre of Salem. Excellent book. She really gets into when Salem kind of becomes this critical metaphor. So if that's interesting to anyone, I find that really interesting. But you also see people like John Adams in his diary references going to, he calls it Witchcraft Hill, but the site where the hangings took place when he's in Salem. Like there's always a curiosity about the Salem witch trials. When leisure travel begins in the late 19th century, people start getting off trains in Salem and knocking on doors and saying, where were the witches hanged? Literally, there's newspapers that say that. Not en masse, certainly, but there is like a tourist interest. As soon as leisure tourism starts in the country, people are showing up and interested in the Salem witch trials. So that's something that is not unique to the 20th century. Certainly, it's got progressively more attractive or interesting to large audiences, but it's something that there's always been this mysterious fascination with the Salem witch trials in American culture.
There are so many more, obviously, that we could talk about. So many more things I wanted to talk about. And as you said at the beginning, it's so deep. It's so complex.
Yeah.
And what I'm about to ask you is maybe the deepest and most complex part of all of this. And so I don't know if you'll be able to just maybe give us some thoughts to think about as we think about the Salem witch trials and the witch panic throughout Europe. One of the things I did not understand, and I feel like I should have, and maybe I'm off about this, but this is its relationship to women.
Yep.
And one of the two things, and you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding either of these things, one of the things that sits with me all the time now is the understanding that maybe predominantly in Europe, the accused were often, maybe mostly, women who were not married with nobody to inherit their property should they go to jail when they lose all their property or die and lose all their property. True?
No.
Okay.
So this is actually an interesting, I'll try to keep this brief.
Okay.
But there are some misconceptions about witch trials, Salem, but like more broadly, witch trials that come in and out of fashion because I've now been working in public history in Salem for almost 10 years. And in those 10 years, it's been actually fascinating to note how certain misconceptions come into fashion and then go away and come back. There's like an ebb and a flow to it. So the property misconception is actually something that's become super popular recently. I have no idea why. I'm sure there's a bigger cultural study that needs to take place as to why this happens, and I'm sure it happens with other historical events as well. So there's a grain of truth to it, as there almost always is to these misconceptions. Women are certainly more vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft during the witch trials period, particularly women who are older, unmarried, widowed, living alone, but also women who are like, push against social boundaries. So maybe they're a little mouthy, argumentative, they're known to fight with their husband or their neighbors. They've done something taboo, like married beneath their station or had a child out of wedlock. They support themselves independently as a midwife. These are people who are very vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft. And often when witch panics start, they're the first people to be accused. So Salem Witch Trials. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne are like the most clear examples of this. Sarah Good's a beggar who's known to be very argumentative. She would kind of publicly grumble at people if she came begging at their house and didn't get as much as she felt she deserved. Sarah Osborne hadn't been to church in a while, which is causing a lot of gossip because she's sick. And she'd also married one of her servants. So lots of, drama there. So that's a trend we absolutely see in the history of witchcraft. But the property element of it, um, so in the case of the Salem witch trials specifically, English law did not allow anyone to gain anything from an accusation of witchcraft. You could not gain any money, you could not gain any land. And that's actually something we have unlearned in recent years. We thought that property was connected to it. It's not. That's one of those things that historians have really taken a deeper look at Massachusetts law and realized was not driving the Salem witch trials. It's a little bit more complicated in Europe, place to place, but generally speaking, it does not seem like people are going after individuals because they're trying to gain something from you. They're not trying to take your land. They're not trying to take your money. It's that they are projecting onto you as a scapegoat. And who do we scapegoat? People who make us feel uncomfortable. Always. People we don't like, and that's true for periods that are not witch hunts as well. If you are looking for a scapegoat, you're going to look for the person in your community you already dislike or distrust. And often that breaks down into women who are a little mouthy, who maybe live alone, the people who are a little socially unusual. So that's a kind of long story short, but the idea that the witch trials are a land grab is something that has recently re-entered pop culture in a very big way. And we've actually made several response videos on our TikTok, on our social media. And there's been fascinating pushback of people arguing with us about it and saying, no, it was a land grab. And you're like, but it wasn't. So, yeah.
This is such an interesting concept that we won't delve into, but this idea of, so then, because what it resonated so deeply when you said that even pertaining to history, things come in and out of fashion.
Yeah.
And
so the example that I always give, or that I've recently really become aware of, is when I inherited my job from my predecessor. I inherited a copy of Marilyn Roach's Day by Day Chronicle, and it was earmarked to a page that debunked the story that 2 dogs were hanged during the Salem Witch Trials. So this was a really popular story years ago, that 2 dogs were hanged in Salem. They were accused of witchcraft and hanged. That is not true. Again, there's a grain of truth. 2 dogs were killed, it seems. They seem to have been shot. Very little information about it in the primary sources. It seems like someone thought one was afflicted by witchcraft and killed it out of fear. Another one was thought to maybe be helping a witch and was killed. Both are cases of just like mob panic. And in both cases, the dog was shot. They certainly weren't accused of being a witch, paraded to the gallows and hanged. But that was so popular that our copy of the Day by Day Chronicle, again, was earmarked to that page because we were getting asked that so often. And in recent years, I haven't been asked that in years now. And hopefully me putting this into this podcast is not going to bring it up again. But,
right.
But it's funny. It's funny how these things kind of cycle in and out of vogue, if you will.
Two last questions. Both can be quick responses to us non-historians who spend time on social media and are just subjected to oodles and oodles of perspectives and opinions, most of which are not educated, most of which are ignorant, myself absolutely included in that. Any quick words you can offer us to take a step back, pause, and just think about that?
So I would say that if someone is claiming to have the cause of the Salem Witch Trials, this was it was this, that is a good tell that that person has not done enough research, because there is no one explanation. It would be wonderful if there was, and that's what we're always kind of searching for. It was a land grab, or it was moldy bread and the girls were hallucinating, the accusers were hallucinating, also debunked. It was a great conspiracy. The girls were all making it up together. It would be great if there was just that one simple answer, but there isn't. There so rarely is in history. So because it's so fresh in my mind, the land grab theory, you'll see these videos of people saying, nobody knows this, but it was a land grab. That's what caused the Salem witch trials. If someone's approaching that subject with that kind of finality, it means that they haven't spent enough time, usually, studying the Salem witch trials. A historian worth their salt, or just a source of public information, because that's not to say that only historians can be informed about the Salem witch trials. I know plenty of people who are just interested in the subject and learn it on their own and are constantly reading and educating themselves. It's not this like exclusive club that you have to have the historian badge to be correct. But that's to say, it's the people who understand the Salem witch trials will be the first to say it's big, it's complicated, and we're still learning. And we're still unlearning the things that were considered common knowledge 30 years ago, 40 years ago. They change now. Our perception, our understanding of the individuals involved, the forces at work, all of that is constantly ebbing and flowing. So as I said at the beginning, this is a great wrap up. One of the best ways that you can start to reliably trust a source is that if that person will say, I'm not sure, I'll have to look it up. This is, I don't know everything, but here's what I've learned thus far. Like, those kinds of terms are the mark of a smart person, of a person who's really taking the time to fully absorb the information. Because if you want to learn about the Salem witch trials, you do need to kind of constantly be absorbing and learning, and just treat everything you see online with a grain of salt. And especially if it's kind of a casual person in their car with their leg up saying, I'm going to tell you what caused the Salem witch trials, that action that they're going to tell you something that's pretty inaccurate. Not always, but often, So those are kind of the best ways, but you know, I hate to say it because we're such a media heavy society. Reading books to learn about the Salem witch trials, Um, if you really are interested in the topic and you hear something, on a TikTok or a podcast or whatever, and that piques your interest, seek out some books and start doing the reading and, you don't have to read boring history books to understand the Salem witch trials. There's some wonderful books out there that break it down in a very interesting way. So that's the Salem witch trials in 1 hour or less.
That's amazing. And then final question. This is going to air just before October.
Yes.
What would you like all of us to know going into October around the Salem witch trials, or not going into October? What would you like us to all keep in mind when we hear any sort of reference to the witch trials?
What a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Keep the balance in mind. I'm not, this is not to say don't watch Hocus Pocus. I certainly will. Don't feel uncomfortable about loving Halloween or pop culture witchcraft. Those are really wonderful parts of our society, and they're very important to us. So don't feel like you have to distance yourself from any of that. Enjoy it. Enjoy Halloween. But especially if you're coming to Salem, or if you're hearing Salem be referenced in a casual way, also keep the reality of the witch trials in mind as well. Think to yourself, is this appropriate? Am I making a joke at the expense of a mass tragedy of people who were killed? There is an important difference between pop culture witchcraft and referencing the Salem witch trials in pop culture in a way that's disrespectful. So I would say that those are kind of the most important things to keep in mind. But because of who I am and where I work, I always have to say that, especially going into that season and, the state of the world, also use it as an opportunity to think about scapegoating, because scapegoating, unfortunately, is something that is always happening. If we feel powerless or threatened or scared, we look for someone to blame, something easy, someone we can point a finger at. In 1692, that was the insidious threat that witches were hiding everywhere, and we have to find all of the hidden witches. In the modern day, there's many other opportunities to scapegoat. So especially if you're interested in Salem, you're interested in witch trials, always, kind of keep that at your core center, because that's the most respectful way to engage with this, is to learn from what really happened and to carry it with you every day.
Oh, that's beautiful. Rachel, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Thank you. No, this is fun. I always love talking to people who are interested and engaged, and this is one of the really fun aspects of my job, truly.
To hear from more amazing women like this one, subscribe to Real Women's Work wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, follow us on social, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all of it's under Real Women's Work. Thank you to all who listen. You are helping to raise the tide for all of us.